Welcome to Perfect Vision. This is a program where you're going to learn something that borders on magic. You're going to learn how to see through the eyes of an artist. You're going to find out that painting and drawing is not just about how you use a brush or how you use a pen. It's about how you see things. In order to do this, I'm going to show you how the great artists saw things. We're going to see through the eyes of the masters. We're going to see through the works that they created, the way they created it, and we're going to see how they used drawing and painting to reach that goal. We're going to show you works by Ingres. We're going to show you works by Vermeer. You're going to see works by Da Vinci, the Impressionists, the Pre-Raphaelites, and paintings that they did, great paintings that used all these techniques rolled up together like magic into this unique vision that we know as the artist's vision. Look at this. What can you see? If you can see something, then you have something in common with Da Vinci. Because Da Vinci said in his own notebooks, if you want to create something new, different and exciting in your painting, take a wall that's splashed with mud and look at it, and there you will find all these wonder of things, all these horses in battles, these Madonnas sitting on the laps of their mothers, children in their mother's arms. Many things can be seen in something as simple as this. When Leonardo was an apprentice, the first thing he would have learned was how to draw. He would have been given things to copy by the master and told to copy them. He would have pierced holes in the lines and pounced them. In other words, he would have let dust of charcoal go through the hole and onto the paper. I can show you this. But there's an easier way he learned to draw. And we know this from a drawing that he did himself in his own notebook of what I call Leonardo's glass. Perspective is nothing other than looking through a clear sheet of glass so that you can see the lines that there are in nature and imitate them by drawing them on the glass itself. Now what he would have done, he would have taken a very thin paintbrush dipped in oil and drawn with that. We're going to use permanent marker here. Now to do this properly, you have to line yourself up and you can't move. And in his drawing you actually see a little thing there you can look through. But if you stay still, you can do pretty much the same effect and it doesn't get in the way of cameras and things like that. So let's have a look at, notice I'm closing one eye here because you see binocular vision will actually change the position of this. So you gotta sort of go with one eye. Now the amazing thing when you look at the drawings of the masters, they're fascinating, you know, because they're very different to our drawings that we would do these days, because they would have had to make their own paper. They would have had to make anything that they used would have to be made themselves. And when you look at the drawings, they're quite often very small. And the other thing, when you look at Leonardo's own notebooks, you're surprised at how many drawings he crammed into a piece of paper. That's because a piece of paper was a precious thing. Acetate would have been very useful to him. You could have wiped it off with nail polish remover afterwards, which we can do, and use it again if we want. Now, perspective itself is essentially a mathematical, geometrical formula. When he went to do his drawing of the Adoration of the Magi, in the background we can see the master's mind at work. And there, in his drawing, he actually put in the whole construction, the technical construction of this elaborate, stepped architectural structure. It's all there, and you can see the vanishing point in the distance and the lines radiating out the way he describes when he talks about the sheet of glass. He describes the way that lines meet the viewer through the glass, where they stop at the glass, where they meet the eye. That's where we draw them. And of course that's different depending on your point of view, which is an expression that actually comes from the practice of perspective. The wonderful thing about perspective here when you're looking at a painting side on is that it creates what's called foreshortening. Now, foreshortening is the painter's enemy because it's really hard to do that. If you see these paintings by Caravaggio, where you see a hand come straight out to point at you or go up like this, the way I'm looking down the lens now, where you see one hand really big in the screen and the other one really small in the distance. Things like this, that's called foreshortening. Very difficult to draw. This would be a good way to learn though. Now, this understanding of perspective brought about one of the great changes that became known as the Renaissance in art history, because it meant for the first time they could make things look really real. Now, here's an idea. Why don't you take a sheet of acetate, stick it on your window at home, find some way of keeping your eye still, use a stick, prop it up, or make something taped to a table just to keep the position of your eye straight in one place. Close one eye and draw with this Chinograph is a good thing, or a permanent marker. A Chinograph is like a wax pencil. It sticks to the surface of the glass, which you won't have to do because you have the acetate there. So give that a try. It's amazing what you see. So let's look through the eyes of Da Vinci and see what he saw and look at what he was chasing after literally. What he wanted to do was to capture this image of beauty forever on this wonderful painting that he did of Leda and the swan. So he started with an inner vision that was built upon his sketches, scribbled over many times until he felt he had something. He had a pose that he wanted. And then he looked towards life, because life taught him everything, and he learned everything through experience. And of course, the only way to learn how to paint a human figure is to look at the human figure. So Linda's here today to help us see what Da Vinci saw and to help us capture this image of beauty. And Linda's going to move into the pose quite similar to the pose of the Leda. These statues that inspired the Renaissance were being dug up in Rome all over the place. And what was happening was that artists and sculptors were seeing these things for the first time and they were captivated. They couldn't understand, how do they get such grace into stone? And then they tried to imitate this in their painting. And they judged everything very carefully. Even anatomy, they realized, became much more important. Here we have the pointing finger that you'll see in all of Da Vinci's works. And we'll talk about that later. Da Vinci, he would have done this for hours, asking his model to correct at the pose and then to return the next day for another few hours. But because of the wonders of modern technology, we can just use a photograph, which I think Da Vinci might have killed for if he could have got one then. He did have the camera obscura and he would have used that to help him. But when it came to getting the perfection that he was after, he needed to do more. This is the image that changed the world, because this was the image that when artists saw for the first time, changed the way they saw the world. And as a consequence, this changed the way everybody saw the world. It was because of the fact that the only visual representation around to be had was from the hand of the artist that this image became so important. And it's this image that Da Vinci asked people if they wanted to be an artist, a young aspiring apprentice or whatever. You should look at this image, he said. If you see this image and the means used to create this image, it will help you become a better painter. And he wrote this down in his notebook. And because of that, he's credited with being one of the first people to bring it to the public's attention. We don't know how public that public was. It may have been the artistic public, the people in the know, but it didn't matter. Because once Raphael saw a portrait with the real tones that Leonardo used and captured in his Benoit Madonna, once he saw that, it changed the way Raphael painted. And when people saw the way Raphael painted, it changed the way other people painted. And as a consequence, we still inherit that vision. We still live with the legacy of Leonardo. What became known as the camera obscura, the dark room, in actual fact had a huge effect on painting. And it's this effect that we tried to replicate in the system, the process, the method that we use in this painting demonstration. So when we look at a portrait by Leonardo, we're looking at someone who saw the world in this way, with his very eye as a camera that accurately caught the world about him. And it was through this experience that we enjoy the vision that Leonardo enjoyed. So now all we have to do is go and do our painting of Linda as Leda and the Swan from the original Lost Leonardo. So now we have the drawing finished, and with that drawing is all our design worked out, and it's from that drawing that we take the next step forward, which is into the painting. So what we can do is take that painting using the camera obscura effect I spoke about, and just use modern day equipment to do that, and taking a projector you can get that effect. So we just put it up onto a board, and in a sense we start at the end. Now it's not quite the end, because of course we're going to do more to the image to make it more like a painting. So now let's start off with the first step that Leonardo took to do his painting in the workshop. Over here we have a white board, which is the surface that Leonardo would have painted on. Now Leonardo wouldn't have used canvas. In fact, oil painting was new to Leonardo, and this was to be a cause of a lot of trouble for Leonardo, because later on with his experiments we've inherited some of that trouble. Trying to come to terms with oil paint was a new experience for the Renaissance artists, because up to that point they worked with tempera, which is an egg-based medium, and it works layer over layer. Oil painting is fantastic, but because it was so new, and because Leonardo was such a scientist, the Pope said of him, "This man will never do anything. He starts making his varnishes before he starts the painting." And he was so right. He knew exactly what was in the mind of Leonardo. Leonardo, being such a perfectionist, was planning way ahead. And the problems that came up, well, we can see that in the Last Supper, and we can also see it in the Anghiari fresco. Both suffered badly. Now, the surface we're going to take is an imitation of the Renaissance artist's surface at that time. It's wood. In those days you would have had taken planks of wood, put them together, and then sand them down perfectly, which is why nowadays you actually see sometimes little cracks going right down between maybe the model's face It's terrible. We're suffering from this now because you see, of course, the wood splits and separates in time. And then this is why there's so much repair in a lot of Leonardo's work, because people, year after year after year, were seeing the growing changes of his painting. It's as if his painting had a life of its own, which is what made it so special. So we're going to take the effect of the camera obscura and we're going to sort of like skip ahead, you know, a bit, because we don't have to set up everything. All we have to do is take our image using modern technology. So what we've done is we've taken the different layers, then we have the original image obviously of the model, and we have then the image of the background, genuine Italian background. This is taken in Florence on the trip to Florence, and we have the mountains, the Dolomites. Now I have to admit I never got as far as the Dolomites, so what I did is I stuck them in. So here we have them in the background. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to do a little faint outline of those mountains here. Just going to take a little pencil mark here along and just rough out those mountains. The beautiful thing about the tops of mountains is, of course, that the shape can change a bit, you know. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to be perfect. In this case, we'll work it over again in the oil paint anyway. And then we have the hills. So we're keeping these marks nice and light. Now, the other thing that's beautifully demonstrated in all of Leonardo's paintings are those wonderful, misty, airy, that incredible atmosphere that you get as you reach back into space. It's like as though the camera zooms in and it just brings up the beauty of these mountains. Now, that's an effect that was deliberately created, and there's even a name for that effect, whereby something appears in the distance to you, sorry. And that effect is called aerial perspective. A painting, as you know, is a different type of experience to watching films being made. I'm pretty sure if Da Vinci was alive today, he'd be in charge of some Hollywood production company, because I think he would have loved all the special effects and post-production. He'd probably be developing Toy Story or something and the software for it, or he'd be at the forefront of technology, you can be sure of that, because that's where he was at his time. And that technology was a lot more sophisticated than we give it credit for. He was building canals. He was actually trying to understand the way water worked. So now we can start putting in the figure of, well, Linda, our Lida. But to do that, I'm going to start using now the permanent marker to do that. And the reason for that is the edges are harder here and they're going to need to be more defined. Now, when you look at the early Leonardo da Vinci paintings, you'll actually see that this is the way he arranged, once he was happy with the composition, in his version of Photoshop, which was his notebook. He actually would go on then and very carefully outline the design that he was happiest with in a very firm outline. Now, you wouldn't see that outline, you'd never see a line around a figure in Da Vinci like you would around Botticelli. And Botticelli's angels have always these very fine, you'll see this line around Botticelli's work and his angels and his Primavera and Birth of Venus. You'll see this fine line around all his painting work. But what was different about Da Vinci is that he saw things differently. Okay, so I'm going to finish that there, and then we're going to get on to the next stage. And we'll talk about the foreground and the middle ground then. Now, I'm going to tell you a secret. And what it is this. Behind a lot of the Renaissance masters' paintings, and many paintings up as far as the 18th century, is a secret geometry. In other words, it's an underpinning structure which helps the artist see the composition. Now, this isn't an easy thing to do, because what you have to do is think about two things at the same time. You have to think about your drawing, and you have to think about this structure. Now, why? Why do they go to the trouble of putting that structure into their paintings? Well, there's a lot of reasons. One reason is that they were following the secrets of the masters before them. In other words, they were looking back to the Greek and Roman architects and sculptors who used this geometry in their work, because they believed this geometry had an idealistic beauty that made things look good. It had an inner harmony, and it's this harmony that really came back into painting. Now, it didn't all start with Leonardo. The fact of it was, the medieval painters were following this structure even more firmly than the Renaissance painters were, but the Renaissance painters had to do it differently. So let's have a look. I'm after putting a geometry into this drawing. Since we're at the drawing part, it's a good time to have a look at it. This drawing has particular elements to do with the golden section. I'll explain that to you now. Over here, you have essentially a square at the beginning of the painting, at the bottom part of it. You see it from there to there. In other words, the width from there to there is the same as from there to there. That's the golden section. In other words, we've taken the actual painting and put a cut in it, which cuts it right at this point, right just there. And that particular line is essential to the harmony of the work. So next thing you have is this spiral, which is created by a series of these squares as they chop up this space. So you've got a square here, you have another square here. You see, you take that width and you cut it here. So you have a square there and there. Do you see it? That's a square. And then that creates another golden section. It's a self-replicating geometry. So next thing, you have another square here, and then you've got another square here, and then another square here, and another, and forever. It goes on into infinity. This is the strange thing about that particular geometry. It actually goes on forever. And when you superimpose it, in other words, you can take that structure and put it up here, you can actually get a series of spirals happening throughout the painting, which creates this beautiful movement. And you can just see, I've put a hint of it over on this side here. You see, the spirals are created. Here's one here, you see. This is the radius of a circle that matches the corners of the square up here, in here, round here, and on into infinity. That one goes off into the mountains. So the other spiral comes around this way, because of course it can happen over this side of the painting too, and it comes all the way around to the tip of her finger, which points directly at her heart. But now we're going to go into the painting itself. Now, the way that Leonardo painted wasn't the same way you might approach it straight away. They actually used layer over layer over layer, glazes and undercoats and overcoats, and it was amazing the way, if you x-ray one of these paintings, to have a look at what's going on behind. It's fascinating, except in the case when they use lead white. Then they can't x-ray it, because lead white blocks out all the rays. They find this in some of the paintings. So let's just get into the painting phase. We're going to put in one of these undercoats, and we're going to put in a black ground, which isn't really black at all. It's blue and brown, raw umber, deep blue, mixed together to create a black. So let's just lash into some of that there. Now it'll come out as a blue. Now I'm putting this in not an oil paint, I'm putting it in acrylic. And the reason for that is because it'll allow me to paint on top of it again when it dries. If I put in a coat of oil, I'd have to paint over the oil, and there'd be no point really, because it would still be wet. Now, for Leonardo it was different, because he had the time. He could go and he could work layer over layer of oil. And it wasn't just oil he used, he also used glazes. as they say, this is what the Pope didn't understand, you see, because the Pope thought Leonardo was working on a varnish. He wasn't. Leonardo was actually working on his glazes, his underglazes. Now, in the old days, they used to have to do this by using different layers of tempera over, for instance, if they wanted to create a green, they would take a blue and they'd paint yellow on top of it when the blue was dry. So that meant that you'd have to plan out the painting. You couldn't do it any other way. This explains another thing. This is why colours on paintings change all the time, because there's chemical things going on here. And as time goes on, a blue might become a little bit more green, or a green might become a bit yellow, or things like that happen all the time. You see that in the works of Vermeer, for instance. There's nowhere you'll see it more than in Da Vinci, particularly in the Mona Lisa. When you look at the Mona Lisa, you'll see all the background's gone all green. And this led one of the commentators to talk about the Mona Lisa. He said, she's like a diver in deep seas. She's like a vampire that only comes out at night time. It's that sort of folklore that surrounds the Mona Lisa that has turned it into the icon that it is. And in a sense, if you keep focusing on the Mona Lisa, you miss a lot of other stuff that Da Vinci was up to. Okay, that looks pretty much it. You can never know, so I'm just going to turn off this for now and see what we got. Yeah, that seems to be it, and it'll bring us to our next stage. So now we can get on to the next coat, the glazes. So it's a step-by-step process. The next step are the glazes. And this is the part that Leonardo loved getting his teeth into, because it's like the under part of the painting whereby you've got the colours begin to emerge. Now we have this blocked in, and this made some areas very, very dark when you got to the final part of the painting. So now we're going to get into some of the areas of light and shade. We're just going to take a Van Dyke brown and we're going to turn it into a glaze. Now a glaze is essentially, it's a translucent oil. You can see through it, and it allows you to do this. The fresco painters used to call it synopia, because it's like a little wash underneath everything. And we can just begin to put in some of the layers of tones. As you can see the white through it. It's a little bit like watercolour, really. You can actually build it up like a watercolour. We can start to put the first tones onto our skin, which we'll work over. Now, Leonardo spent so much time when he was a young painter working on his Adoration. It never got past this stage. I think the main problem was he just had too many figures in it. Another artist had to come in and step in and take over the idea. I'd say that wasn't the last time that happened. And what this process allows you to do is just to get a feel for the overall colour consistency of the painting, to see the whole painting. That's the idea, to see the whole painting at once. You want to quickly get to the point where you can see all the bits together. Yes, we need a bit more green in that. And this is a great way of doing it, because you don't make too much of a commitment too soon. A good drawing it's just the same process. You never make too much of a commitment too soon. You go in and you put down your tone and get a feel for the subject matter. There's a great tradition of all the subjects that were being painted by artists in Florence and Italy at the time. They were referring all the time to someone who painted something similar before. In this case, as what was going on with a lot of artists such as Botticelli, and later on you had Raphael, Michelangelo, of course, himself, they all were interested in reviving classicism, and they brought that into the way they saw the human figure. And when Da Vinci approached the human figure, he took first the man, and he created his famous figure of the Vitruvian man. I'm sure you've seen it. It's on the coinage in Italy at the moment. It's the guy that stands just like that. And people wonder, I think he's up more like this, can't quite remember, something like that. And people wonder, what on earth is that all about? Well, what he was doing was he was looking for this proportion, this geometry that was consistent. First of all, he was trying to turn the square into a circle. And then he was taking different measurements from that square and circle and showing how it fits into the perfect human form as seen by the classical sculptors and painters. So you'd have this face and the height of the face, or the height of the head, and how many heads would fit into the body, how many heads would fit into the length of the arm, or how many ears would fit into the length of the body. All these things were proportionally related together. And that's what that drawing was all about. It was a geometry exercise. Now, what Da Vinci was all about when he was dealing with the female form was following this classical tradition. And what that meant was following this notion of perfection, this idea of perfection. And he was always looking for this perfection, which is another reason why he probably didn't finish some of those works of his. Because perfection takes time. Da Vinci's master, Verrocchio, was in fact a very successful artist. He was so successful that Da Vinci didn't leave him until he was, in his late 20s, which is quite unusual because he could have left sooner. But Leonardo was a late developer. He developed this whole new way of seeing things very slowly. And I'd say he was a very valued member of staff, and Verrocchio knew it. And that's why if we look at some of Verrocchio's paintings, such as the Baptism of Christ, you can really see the Leonardo touch there. And the other thing about his apprenticeship to Verrocchio was that Verrocchio was a master of all trades in the art, so to speak. He sculpted, he painted, he also did small engineering projects. So Verrocchio would have been an excellent teacher for Da Vinci. And that's why Da Vinci never thought anything of doing more than one art. Plenty of oil at this point. Now you can take some oil in that, and the beauty of having that black and white blocked in already is that we don't lose the drawing. That's the reason why we put it in there. We'll forever keep that drawing. And the other thing about it is when you make a mistake, you can just wipe it. And you can be sure that Leonardo used his fingers a lot because of his method of painting, which became known as sfumato. Particularly when he modelled the human figure, he would have used his finger around the edges. We'll get more paint on, it'll be easier to see it, but It'll be interesting if someday they can recreate a clone from the DNA, they're going to be able to make Da Vinci again, but I won't hang around and hold my breath. So now let's get some skin colour on there. Take a little bit of red, yellow, a tiny tip of blue, and get some colour onto that. Now what you'll notice about the shapes in this composition is that it is Leonardo-esque. There's a new word for you. And the reason for that is I want to get some of those unusual shapes that you see at the back of Da Vinci's paintings, particularly on the Virgin and the Rocks, where you see the shape of the figure seems to meld into the shapes of the rocks in the cave surrounding the Virgin and St. John and Jesus and the angel. And it's that sort of play of shape, a little bit like a crazy jigsaw or something that does something very attractive for the eye, makes the eye want to dwell and stay and look. Because Leonardo, he was always after what he called sweetness. He actually put a book together about how to paint, and he intended it to be published after he died and left it to his then apprentice, well really more like an administrator that worked with him at that stage when he was older, Melzi. And Melzi compiled his notebooks into this treatise on painting. And Leonardo describes in it how we should strive for sweetness, that every effect in the painting should be to lift the mind, to elevate the soul, to make it think of higher things and contemplate life, the universe and everything. So there's no reason why you shouldn't enjoy doing that. And he wanted to help you enjoy doing that. So I just start to put in the first tones. And really, this is where the work began. And a good master would have had his pupil working away, giving him instructions, showing him and telling him to correct things or put more of this and less of this. But we can be sure, because of the fact there were so few paintings, that there's a great deal of Leonardo's own touch, of his own hand in a lot of his work. And here we see the beginning of sfumato, the beginning of this modelling, this chiaroscuro it's called, whereby you take light and dark. And you see this in filmmaking and a lot where they used it, particularly in black and white movies, is a good example. If you take one of those film noir movies and have a look at them, you see the way everything is dark and light, but it's where the light meets the dark. In the drama, as well as in the technique, that the beauty occurs, where it catches the eye. And so he'd start to take his thumb, and this is what really changed the way everybody see. It's amazing to think it probably came from using the camera obscura, whereby he was trying to capture all the different tones there are. He realised there was loads of tones. How could he get all those tones unless he experimented by rubbing them together? And it was this trying to make it look real and three-dimensional, like we see in the leg here, where it begins to look where one colour, you can see I'm rubbing in to the colour, and you see in the calf of the leg there now, you can see I'm beginning to get the feeling of the roundness of the form of the leg. And that was what, when Raphael came along and saw the Benoit Madonna, as it's now called, when Raphael saw that, he never painted the same again. It changed the way he saw the world around him. You can look at Raphael up to the point he came from Urbino to Rome. He came to Rome and Florence, saw the works of Da Vinci, and went away, painted his own Madonna. And when you see his Madonna, the pinks, or some of his other Madonnas that he did. After that point in time, he changed forever. So he had to give some credit to Leonardo da Vinci for his own artistic development. Freud wrote a whole analysis of Leonardo da Vinci. And this analysis has been analysed ever since because people are fascinated with him. One of the things that Freud said about da Vinci was he was obsessed with the image of the woman. And you see, if you look at da Vinci's works, you see a similar face come out of a lot of the beautiful, sweet, pretty faces that he did in his angels and his Madonnas and in Leda herself. And it makes you wonder, why did he paint so many women? Now, it seems to us that one of the reasons for this that might have led to his preoccupation was the fact that he was born illegitimate. He may not have seen much of his mother. And in fact, at 14, he was apprenticed, so he certainly wouldn't have seen much of her then. His father, who took him under his wing, as it were, led him to the studio of Verrocchio. And there he would have had to have learned all the trade to do with being an apprentice that was given down, handed down by the master. Now, when we look at the faces of the women in Da Vinci's paintings, we can see there is an obsession with loss. That's up to you what you think or not. But in my mind, when I look at it, I see he is looking for beauty. He's looking for that female beauty in his life that perhaps was absent when he was young. And maybe in many ways what we're looking at when we see his Madonna is actually this mother figure that he had lost from a very young age. Now, just working on that fabric there. You see this in a lot of his drawings and preparations for paintings that became cartoons, as they were known. Cartoon is the word that's come down to us. It actually comes from the word carton, meaning essentially, a type of hard paper. But the term cartoon stuck. And today, of course, we use it in reference to animation. But the Leonardo cartoon that I'm talking about, that showed how much he worked on the drapery. He was so interested in how he could capture the drapery. And this comes from his apprenticeship days when young apprentices were given pieces of cloth that they'd dip in plaster and they'd hang over a chair, and then they'd be told, "Now go draw that, son, now. Let me see what you've done when it's finished," So the young students would go away and work on it. And catching drapery in the pictorial form was an art in itself, because it's so difficult in many ways. You got to go tone by tone. But here you're going to you start off with your main tone and then you go in with your darker tones and you try and capture some of the shadows. Okay, I'm going to have to stop there, because if I don't, well, there'll be no more painting. Everything's too wet. If I want to work the way Da Vinci worked, I'm going to have to work dry layer over dry layer, glaze over glaze. So I'll bring this away, I'll do some more work on it, and we'll come back then and we'll invite Linda back and see what she thinks of the finished piece. on there a second. I'll get this down. Right, Linda. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
It's gorgeous. Wow. That's lovely. Absolutely gorgeous. My God.
So this is what I saw when I
it's
looked at
lovely.
you.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Wow.
So take a moment to take it in and stand back a little bit from it.
Yeah.
And you see if you get a good view of it.
It's gorgeous. Background is lovely as well. Can't believe it's painted. It's amazing.
And did you ever imagine yourself in such surroundings?
Not in a painting, unless it was in a previous life.
Maybe. Well, maybe that's where it was. Maybe it's you in a previous life we've caught here today. Well, look, thank you very much for all your hard work posing for it.
Okay, thanks a lot.
In the hard, hot lights here, and hopefully this has captured something of you forever. Some of these classical poses that you see in these paintings, they actually have a whole idea behind them for you to discover as to what it might mean. So maybe over the time that you take to look at this, you might find meanings in the painting for yourself. You know, because you can see down here you have a little boat and you have a crossroads down here.
Yeah.
And you have these mountains in the background, and each of these are symbols for something, maybe about your life or about life in general, you know.
Yeah, it's lovely.
And that brings us to the end of this programme. A programme which I hope has shown you the world through Da Vinci's eyes, through the eyes of an artist. And we'll come along and we'll discover how other artists have seen the world before them and how they interpret it in their paintings, and maybe come across some more master secrets for us to discover. So until the next time, thank you very much.